Welcome to part 2 of the deepest dive into the Romanov DNA story that nobody asked for. In part 1, we talked about a grave discovered near Yekatarinberg in Russia, where the lives of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, and the family's 4 servants met a violent end in July of 1918. Archaeologists excavated the remains of 9 adult individuals from this grave, and DNA analysis identified Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. Not everyone was convinced by these results and the conclusions drawn from them, and various critiques came out after the publication of that first Romanov DNA paper. The grave only contained 9 individuals instead of the expected 11. If these are the Romanovs, 2 of their children are missing. This discrepancy was interpreted in multiple ways. Some people argue that these couldn't be the Romanovs at all, because the number of people recovered from the grave doesn't match the number of people who we know were executed with Tsar Nicholas in Yekaterinburg. However, this argument is based on the assumption that everyone had been buried together in the same grave. It's also based on the assumption that when the Romanovs and their servants were herded into the basement of the Apadiev house, none of them left alive, and none of them escaped. After the execution in 1918, the Bolsheviks only reported the death of Tsar Nicholas. They claimed Tsarina Alexandra and the couple's only son, Tsarevich Alexei, had been sent away from Yekaterinburg. But they didn't mention Nicholas and Alexandra's 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. They also didn't produce any corpses. With no bodies to prove that Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children had died, rumors spread that some of them had escaped. This was nothing new for a case in which members of a royal family have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and it's a theme we've explored on this channel before with the stories of Prince Louis Charles of France and Caspar Hauser. When rumors like this get started and people appear claiming to be a missing member of a royal family, there can be some really serious consequences. This isn't even the first time something like this has happened with Russian royalty. At least 3 different people claim to be Dmitry Ivanovich, son of Ivan the Terrible, and they're referred to as false Dmitries. There's also Emilian Pugachev, who claimed to be Tsar Peter III and led a rebellion against Catherine the Great, who had usurped the throne from Peter. If you don't know that whole story, absolutely look into it, it's wild. People did not wait long to begin claiming they were Romanovs who had escaped from Yekaterinburg. As early as autumn of 1918, only months after the execution, a woman appeared claiming to be Anastasia. Other people popped up saying they were Tsarina Alexandra or Tsarevich Alexei, but the most famous claimant, arguably the world's most famous royal claimant ever, spent over 30 years fighting to prove her identity as a Romanov. The legal battle over this woman's identity led to the longest trial in German history. How did we get there? In 1920, a young woman was pulled out of a canal in Berlin. She was taken to an asylum and diagnosed with depression, but she didn't provide her name. While staying in the asylum, she saw a German magazine with an article about the Russian Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And in 1921, the woman revealed her identity. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanov. Or maybe Grand Duchess Tatiana. At first, there was some confusion over which Grand Duchess she said she was, but eventually she started going by the name Anastasia Tchaikovsky. This name came from part of her story about how she escaped from Yekaterinburg. She wouldn't use the name Anna Anderson until she was checking into a hotel in the United States and used a false name so she wouldn't attract attention. Despite that hotel episode, the claims made by the woman calling herself Anastasia Tchaikovsky attracted a huge amount of attention. This included a lot of news and press coverage. She convinced a lot of people that she was Grand Duchess Anastasia, that she had escaped Yekaterinburg. How did she do that? She knew so much detail about the Romanovs, details of the lives that people thought she could only know if she really was a Romanov. Some people said she had the same eyes as Anastasia, the same eyes as her father Nicholas. She also shared a specific physical characteristic with Anastasia called Hallux valgus. This is the medical term for bunions. I told you bunions would get involved. If you thought I won't use any opportunity I can find to teach you something about the human body, you were wrong. Let's talk about feet bones. Hallux valgus happens when extra pressure on your big toe pushes it out of alignment. The big toe ends up being pushed towards your other toes, and the misalignment really shows up at the metatarsophalangeal, or MTP, joint. The human foot is made up of an absurd number of bones, and they're divided into 3 groups. You have your tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges, your toe bones. The singular form of phalanges is phalanx, like the ancient Greek battle formation. The metatarsophalangeal joint is where metatarsal 1 meets what's called the proximal phalanx of the big toe, and this is where bunions form with Hallux valgus. So we divide the foot into 3 groups of bones. You have your tarsals down in here, your metatarsals, these long skinny ones, and then your phalanges. So when we're talking about Hallux valgus and bunions and the metatarsophalangeal joint, we're talking about this joint right here. So you have your first metatarsal and your proximal phalanx of your big toe. And this foot happens to actually be doing what Hallux valgus does, where your big toe is being pushed in towards the rest of your toes. So very glad that this cast just happened to do what I was trying to demonstrate. So yeah, there's feet bones for you. And bunions. So, is there something about Hallux valgus and bunions that makes this a useful characteristic for comparing Anastasia with someone claiming to be her? Is this a rare condition? No, not really. Anyone can develop bunions because they have various different causes. People can be born with bunions, which is referred to as congenital Hallux valgus. Wearing shoes that crowd the toes close together, the way a person walks, or the inflammation caused by rheumatoid arthritis can create that extra pressure that results in bunions. You're also at a higher risk for developing bunions if you have a history of foot injuries or your biological parents have bunions, which prompts the question of genetics playing a role in Hallux valgus. This is not the video for that discussion, but all of these different causes mean Hallux valgus and bunions are common. It has been estimated that up to 1/3 of Americans have bunions, so it's not a particularly useful trait in this situation. Not everyone was convinced by the bunions or what this woman knew about the Romanovs and their lives. She had access to a lot of information that had been published about Russia's imperial family, so people argued that she didn't have to be Anastasia or any of the other Grand Duchesses to have known all of these details. Enough people discussed her claims that they wrote and published books about her during her lifetime, and the first Anastasia survival film came out in 1928. The woman calling herself Anastasia spent several years moving around between different hospitals and living with people who believed her and supported her, often people who had left Russia as a result of the revolution. For a while she lived with Duke Georg Nikolaevich de Beauharnais of Leuchtenberg. He was a great-grandson of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, and a descendant of Eugene de Beauharnais, the stepson of Napoleon Bonaparte. I really cannot. He's just everywhere. Duke Georg and his ancestor Eugene are also distant relatives of Grand Duchess Stephanie de Beauharnais of Baden, who we met in another story of a royal claimant, Caspar Hauser. What's the point of claiming to be a lost member of a royal family? As we've seen, these claims could attract a lot of attention. Some claimants started rebellions in attempts to put themselves on the thrones they declared rightfully belonged to them. Supporters might give a claimant money or gifts or provide them with somewhere to live. In the case of the Romanovs, there was the potential to gain access to a lot of money. This money had been deposited in a bank in Berlin by Tsar Nicholas II. In her efforts to claim this money, the woman calling herself Anastasia Tchaikovsky got involved in a legal battle that lasted 37 years. The longest in Germany's history. Her appeal was rejected because the court decided she hadn't provided enough evidence to prove that she was Nicholas's daughter, Grand Duchess Anastasia, but a verdict wasn't released until 1970, the same year the album Black Sabbath was released. By that time, she no longer lived in Germany. In 1968, she moved to the United States and married a man named Jack Manahan, changing her name to Anastasia Manahan. Anastasia Manahan died on February 12, 1984 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and her remains were cremated. A decade would pass before DNA could put her claims to the test. So now we've caught up with the publication of the first Romanov DNA study in 1994. Now we have genetic data from the Romanovs, though there's still more controversy about those conclusions. The availability of that data meant it could be compared to Anastasia Manahan's DNA. But her remains were cremated, which can destroy DNA. Where could anyone locate her biological material for DNA samples? Hospital archives and a bookstore in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In 1974, Anastasia Manahan underwent surgery to remove a bowel obstruction. This surgery involved removing part of her intestines, and those parts were fixed in formaldehyde and preserved in paraffin wax in order to be kept by the hospital's archives as pathology specimens. Another legal battle erupted, this time over who got custody of these tissue samples for testing, but other samples were located too. Jack Manahan had preserved locks of his wife's hair in envelopes that ended up with his library, which was then purchased by a bookstore in Chapel Hill after his death. A woman named Susan Grindstaff Burkhart bought the envelopes containing the locks of hair for $20 and probably then took them home to show her husband, who happened to work in a DNA research lab. This is the craziest part of the story for me. A genealogist then put Susan in touch with Anastasia Manahan's biographer, Peter Kurth, and he made the arrangements for the DNA testing. 3 independent labs tackled DNA extraction and analysis of the preserved intestinal tissue and 6 hairs. The Forensic Science Service in the UK, Pennsylvania State University, and the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Maryland. Importantly, the hair still had roots. The follicle in the root of a strand of hair contains nuclear DNA. Again, that's the DNA that lives in the nucleus of your cells, and you inherit your nuclear DNA from both of your biological parents. The hair shaft contains mitochondrial DNA, which, as we've discussed before, lives in your cell's mitochondria and you inherit from your biological mother. The labs tested both types of DNA, and all 3 labs received the same results. First, they were able to determine that the hair and the preserved intestinal tissues came from the same person. That's a really good start, but what about a comparison with the individuals from the grave near Yekatarinberg who had been identified as the Romanovs? Let's revisit short tandem repeats real quick. These are short, repeated chunks of DNA that vary in number between individuals. These are inherited from our biological parents, so Anastasia Romanov would have short tandem repeats that match Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra. The short tandem repeat, or STR, profile of Anastasia Manahan differed from the profiles of Nicholas and Alexandra in 4 places, excluding the possibility of Nicholas and Alexandra being her biological parents. 4 might not sound like a lot, but it's too many differences to establish a parent-child relationship. Similar results came from the mitochondrial DNA analysis. Anastasia Manahan's mitochondrial DNA sequence differed in 6 places when compared to the sequences obtained from Alexandra, the 3 daughters buried with her, and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a female line descendant of Alexandra's sister Victoria. Again, this was too many differences in their DNA sequences. Anastasia Manahan, the world's most famous royal claimant, was not Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanov. If she wasn't Anastasia Romanov, then who really was this woman? During the 1920s, rumors of an alternative identity began spreading. Some people recognized this woman as Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had gone missing in Berlin in 1920, right before the woman who would become Anna Anderson or Anastasia Manahan started claiming to be a Russian Grand Duchess. To explore the question of whether or not Anastasia Manahan was really Franziska Szankowska, Franziska's great-nephew Karl Maucher donated a sample to the Forensic Science Service laboratory for DNA testing. Karl was the son of Franziska's niece and the grandson of her sister, so he would have the same mitochondrial DNA sequence as Franziska. Okay, so here's what our mitochondrial DNA family tree for Franziska Szankowska is going to look like. We'll put Franziska here. And she had a sister, Gertrude. Gertrude had a daughter, Margareta. And then Margareta had a son, Karl. Karl's mitochondrial DNA sequence didn't match the sequence of Tsarina Alexandra and her family. Good, that's what we would expect if they're not closely related. There were 5 identical matches between Karl Maucher and Anastasia Manahan, suggesting that he could be her maternal relative. When compared to mitochondrial DNA sequences in databases, the sequences shared by Karl Maucher and Anastasia Manahan were rare. They didn't match any of the sequences in the database. This rarity further supported the idea that these 2 individuals were related to each other. Statistical analysis put the probability of the match between Karl Maucher and Anastasia Manahan being completely random as less than 1 in 300, and that there was a 98.5% probability that Anastasia Manahan and Franziska Szankowska were the same person. Additionally, Karl's mother, Margareta Ehrlich, donated a DNA sample to the University of California at Berkeley for testing. She was the daughter of Franziska's sister Gertrude, and her sequence matched both Karl Maucher and Anastasia Manahan. Ultimately, these results support the hypothesis that Anastasia Manahan or Anna Anderson and Franziska Szankowska were the same person. So that solved one Romanov mystery. However, there was still more controversy surrounding that grave near Yekatarinberg. Did those remains truly belong to the Romanovs? If they did, where are the two missing Romanov children? In part 3, we'll meet members of the extended Romanov family as teams of geneticists challenge the original Romanov DNA paper. I hope you'll join me for the resulting drama. Thank you for watching.